without one of those lovely things of Helen Evans in the title of the talk, but with the image of the signature poster banner that hung in front of the Met, off and on during the exhibition, because we had so many exhibitions they kept rotating. And it is a show that brought an immense amount of interest from not only Armenians like you, but many people who knew nothing about Armenia and left the show very much impressed by the Armenian tradition, which was one of our goals. And I'm able to tell you about all of this because this will be the first talk I've ever given since the Metropolitan Museum Senior Manager of Market Research, Marketing and External Affairs, Karen Grafstrom, has finished her survey, and nearly 200 people were interviewed during the show about why they'd come, what they saw, what they were interested in. And one of the points that Karen made that I'm incredibly pleased with is that 93% of those people said that they had learned so much from what the show contained, from the art and from the labels. So our goal to make the world know of the importance of Armenian art and culture is at least to a degree started. And I'd like tonight to focus the talk on two aspects. The exhibition, the reason for the loans from the Manoogian Museum, and something of what the public responded to in the show. We opened the show with this stele from the 4th or 5th century, lent by the History Museum of Armenia, which is thought to represent King Tridat with an animal's head, and certainly Gregory the Illuminator, the converter of the Armenians as a people to Christianity. So we began the Middle Ages with that point in time where Armenians as a people became Christian, and that is more or less when most people start the Middle Ages. And we ended it with the moment when Armenia has widespread access to printed books. And this is again a classical definition of the Middle Ages, when you move from the handwritten text to the printed text. And what we have for you to look at from the last gallery of the show is in the upper left, the Friday book, the first published book in Armenia, published in Venice, for merchants and for traders, people that moved goods as you all have for centuries. By the time the show ends, you control trade routes across the world. And then in the lower right, one of the earliest books published at Holy Etchmiadzin, and the loans from Etchmiadzin to the show included a strong request that we not only borrow this book, but we borrow it from Etchmiadzin. It could not come from the Matanadara. So we obeyed. But the interesting thing about it is it's not a religious text. It's the Josephus' war against the Romans. And it is argued by the catalog author that it was a subtle way to urge the Armenians at a moment when both the Turks and the Persians were beating up on them quite heavily, to stand and rebel as the Jews had stood up to the Romans. So it was not an overt act of defiance, but a subtle and sophisticated one. And by that time, in the 17th century, Armenians control all the external trade for Shah Abbasid's empire in Persia. They are forced to move to Persia, to Isfahan, the suburb, to Jaffa, the suburb of Isfahan, deliberately to control the silk trade, and from that they control it all. So was an exhibition in the British Museum recently on Shah Abbas's Persia. It opened with a gallery on the Armenians. Every new idea that went into Shah Abbas's Persia came through the Armenians. You were that influential, you controlled all of the textile trade from India. And one way we can tell how really impressive you were was that in Amsterdam in 1695, one of the popular luxury goods was gigantic maps of the world in the language of the people who were rich enough to pay for them. And one of the languages those maps are published in is Armenian. So what you're looking at is a world map that looks like everybody else's world map, but every word on it is in Armenian. And it's all together, up to date, including the fact that California is an island. Except, and you can, if you go in the show, you can go and see what parts were more well-known than others. And one of the parts that's well-known on the map is northern Latin America, where there are Armenians getting gold and silver from the silver mines for Shah Abbas. So you are everywhere in that period. And we hope that the information that we had in Armenia will live on past the close of the actual exhibition, in part through the catalog whose cover you see on the left, where St. John is so inspired by the words of God coming down like a sword into his mouth that the entrance to his cave radiates with the power of the Word of God. And then with our website, which you now have to go to by going to the Met website, going to exhibitions and going to past exhibitions. But one of the wonderful things that we have on it is an interactive map, where when you go to what you see on the screen and punch each little dot, the site will show up with why it's important to Armenians, from Jamestown, Virginia, where you are at the beginning of the 17th century, to the Philippines, where you are at almost the same date, and everywhere in between. And we tried to bring that world to you in the exhibition. And 3 of the works that made that possible came from the Manoogian Museum. 2 of them are in the next to the last gallery, which you are looking at. At the far end, you're seeing a large altar curtain with sites that are particularly relevant to Armenians in the holy city of Jerusalem. And in the little space to the far right, the very last gallery, you get a glimpse of that map we looked at. And then the long thing you're looking at is the map we will see in a minute. But first we're going to look at about where the camera was when the photograph was taken, at these 3 cases. And on the left, you have 2 containers for parts of the bodies of sainted figures, and both of these go back to the beginnings of the Armenian church. On the left, St. George, George of England, George of everybody, and on the right, St. Shahat who encourages as Catholicos the creation of the Armenian alphabet. And on the right, you have silver book covers, elaborate, handsomely worked book covers from the Armenian community in Caesarea, which Sylvie has studied with great sophistication, and I hope you get a chance to talk to her about them, but I am focusing on the ones in the middle. And 2 of them are from your museum. The hexagonal tile at the upper left and the large egg in the middle. Armenians are important at the ceramic manufacturing center of Kütahya by 1501. That's the earliest ceramic we have with an Armenian inscription on it. The inscription you see on the upper right is from a pilgrim's flask that was lent to us, among many other objects, by the Holy See of the Mother See of Holy Etchmiadzin, and it has the type of blue decoration that is thought to have perhaps been introduced into Kütahya from Chinese motifs brought to the site by Armenians coming from Persia into Ottoman lands when it's particularly unpleasant in Persia. And those are motifs that last until the time of this pilgrim's flask, which is the 1700s. And then you have the large egg, which I profoundly love because the pilgrim's flask takes you to China, the egg takes you back to Western Europe. The big figures are cherubim, the guardians of heaven. You see them in a less elaborate way on the smaller egg to the right that belongs to the Met. But between the 2 wings of the cherubim, there's a little image of the Virgin and Child. And that is an Armenian variation on a Netherlandish print of the late 1600s. And the 3rd work that you lent, which came to be one of my favorite works in the entire exhibition, is the reliquary container of the hand of St. Abel Musa. It is one of a number of reliquary containers with relics in them often that came to the exhibition, and in the survey that Karen Grafstrom took, the reliquaries were one of the things people mentioned as being most meaningful to them. St. Abel Musa's hand is in the central gallery to the exhibition on the far right edge, so you can barely, I can see it, but you can't. It's in the big case at the end. The center of the gallery focused on photographs of Lake Sivan's Church of the 40 Martyrs, which is now part of the theological school for the Armenian community there, and is a very lovely site that I had hoped to show you the inside of in New York, but that didn't work out, so instead we showed you the outside. And what I was trying to do in this gallery was to give people a sense of the church. It is the gallery in which we play liturgical music, and then objects that would fit within the church. I was going to tell people today that the music which came out from around the photographs was described as incredibly moving by a number of people in their survey of the show. But in the corner, where we have a little model of the church from perhaps Ani up on the wall, and then in the case next to it, censers for the incense, and then on the long case at the far left end, the reliquary of St. Abel Musa, who is not like St. George, a saint that we associate easily with the West, but is in fact a saint whose life was written in Syriac in the 9th century. He comes from the East. He is brought by a prince to Ottomar, and a cult is developed around him. And by the 12th century, that cult is rather well known. And so this is a work that we connect to this famous site that so many Armenians and art historians in general admire, at Ottomar, the island in Lake Van. And the other work that we had in the show that connected to it so they could speak to each other is the large banner in the case in the middle of the room. And this is a banner, it's the oldest liturgical embroidery that survives in the Armenian world. It's from 1448. I love the fact that on the sides you're looking at, you have returned to the image that we have in the very beginning of the exhibition. You can't really tell from here, but in the center is Gregory the Illuminator, always strong and standing strong and proud. And to one side in red is King Tridot, turned into a very handsome prince. And on the other side is Saint Ripsime, the woman whom he violates, which then causes him to develop the head of a pig, which brings Gregory the Illuminator in to bring him back to being a human and bringing his people to Christianity with him. That banner is from Ottomar. And in the 15th century, when the Catholicos of the Armenian Church moves back to Greater Armenia, there is a contest between Ottomar and Echmiadzin as who will be the center of the church. And there is a text about the banner being taken from Echmiadzin back to Ottomar and then recovered by Echmiadzin. So we're looking at a time when these things are not just handsome works of art to be admired or the oldest living embroidery, but something that is very important to the fabric of life. And I think the more we learn about it, more we will be able to make Armenia relevant to the larger world. You see the beautiful church at Ottomar, which we normally study for its very elaborate and detailed relief carving on the facade, and then a larger image so you can actually tell what the reliquary looks like of St. Abel Musa. I find that looking at these, you get more a sense of people moving in and out of that church. It's a palace church. It's the king's church. It's the church that becomes a Catholicos. It's a church that for a very long time is very relevant to you, not just when it's built, but into the end of the Middle Ages of this exhibition. And then you have the hand, which would have originally been in a relic container made, possibly when the church was really being built, but which has been loved and cared for so that the actual container you're looking at now has Persian elements and Western European elements and probably comes out of the influence of the Armenians, the very wealthy Armenians who are in New Jolfa and controlling trade routes. And in that same gallery, we had other relics which I think make incredibly telling remarks about the Armenian community and about art in general, and the continuity of the importance of religious works over time to the same people as works become relevant for different things. So you're looking at the large photograph of the church at Lake Sivan, and the works beside it are works that were removed from the church and taken to the History Museum for safekeeping in the Soviet period. And so we were able to give you photographs of the church and objects that came from the church. And the church is most important for the 40 martyrs, the mission to the apostles, not the 40 martyrs, which includes St. Thaddeus, the first of the saints of the apostles to go to the Armenians. And the large reliquary cross on the bottom on the screen is associated by some with being an iron cross brought to Armenia by Thaddeus himself. So that this could conceivably, not likely, go back to the beginning of the Christian era. It is associated now in the course of the history of Armenia with the Bagratid king Ashot II, who was incredibly successful at pushing back Muslim armies that attacked in the Lake Sivan area, and monks from the monastery with which this church in the middle of the room are associated were part of the army that repulsed the Muslims. So he becomes Ashot the Iron, and then the Iron Cross becomes associated with him. And in the very center, there's what must look to you all like a little white dot, but it's a rock crystal, and it's covering a tiny relic of the true cross. And so you have a cross that over time goes with Thaddeus, goes with the crucifixion of Christ himself, goes with a king from roughly 1,000 years after the birth of Christ or death of Christ, and is relevant today because that large silver container it's in is a late 19th century Russian dedication to hold the cross. What I love about the true cross is suddenly in this 13th, 14th century, there are several reliquaries beautifully made, two of which we had in the exhibition, which contain elements of the true cross. So suddenly, in some way that I can't explain to you yet, and I would encourage people to study it, we have the true cross become very central to Armenians, rather than, in fact, Gregory the Illuminator, who's from roughly 300. And the true cross may have been brought to Armenia, as one tradition puts it, by St. Ribsameh herself. I love the idea that it would have been brought to Armenia by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who ruled the Christian East from Constantinople, because he himself was an Armenian. He rules Constantinople. His father was a ranking general in the Byzantine army. He was an Armenian by the time Heraclius becomes emperor. His father controls all of North Africa for the Byzantine Empire. And then Heraclius, the beginning of the 7th century, goes to Persia and regains the true cross that the Persian armies have taken back to their capital of Ctesiphon. So it would be reasonable that as he returns from Persia, he would leave a bit of the true cross with his people, the Armenians. Christina Maranche, who wrote for the catalog, believes that the Armenian church at Marin is actually a building that Heraclius paid for. We have a good deal of evidence of interaction. And then there are later Byzantine emperors who give parts of the true cross to Armenia, because the greatest gift that a Byzantine emperor can give anybody is a piece of the true cross, which resides in Constantinople until the Fourth Crusade. And all of these are gifts you only give to people that are incredibly important to you. So you have some sense of the Armenians' control of the route to the east, particularly in silks that you see. And then we have at the top left the lance that is thought to have pierced Christ's side at his crucifixion, which may have come to Armenia with the centurion who used it, may have come to Armenia with St. Thaddeus. Certainly in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, becomes a possession of the Prosian family, who become quite wealthy and powerful of running trade routes for the Mongols, and they dedicate the lands in a 13th century container to a monastery known for its healing waters, and you all know it as Gegard. And it is the great pilgrimage spot of modern Armenia. It is near Yerevan, and it becomes the monastery of the lands with this gift. So this is a object that is still highly relevant within the Armenian world, to the extent that when a Khachkar was given from Armenia to the United Nations, when Armenia became an independent country, Archbishop Basamian went to Gegard to find the Khachkar that was selected to be sent to New York City, where it's at the UN. Everything we've seen to now, by the time of the full development of the Ottoman Empire, is really connected to the Ottoman Empire. And what we were able to show in the exhibition was this map of every Armenian church in the Ottoman Empire that was drawn in 1691 and lost until 1991. So for 300 years, it sits perfectly safely and well cared for in the library of the University of Bologna, which is not where you would go to look to find an Armenian map. So nobody did. It was ordered by a Bolognese noble when he was sent as part of the retinue of the Venetian ambassador to the Ottoman court. And he has it drawn by an Armenian who is a leading figure in the cultural life of Constantinople, someone employed by the church, someone who is able to provide an accurate record of all of the Armenian churches. So you start at the left end, and that blob of green is the Bosphorus in Constantinople. The big blob of green in the middle is Lake Van, and then right above it is something that's red, and I cut it out and put it in the middle at the top. And that is a group of prelates welcoming someone very important, possibly an Ottoman Pasha, but certainly a Pasha, to Etchmiadzin. And the script underneath it is telling you the story of how Etchmiadzin was founded, as recorded by the Armenian historian Agatangelis, that after Gregory the Illuminator has converted the Armenians, Christ descends from heaven, and you see Christ coming from the loopy gray crowds. It's the signature image of the exhibition, and he descends to earth, and he strikes the earth with a golden hammer, and that's where the first church for the Armenians is built. But what's wonderful about this beautifully embroidered silk, that is actually a gift from the Armenians in New Julfa to Etchmiadzin, is you've got two angels at the upper right, and they are showing a secondary vision. They are showing what the original church looks like at the time of the donation. So around 1700, and if you work your way across from the church on the textile to the church on the drawing to the church itself, you see that around 1700 it becomes somewhat standardized in its shape and its importance, and that it is an incredibly central part of the Armenian identity. And another aspect of that is Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark landed, where Armenians believe that they are descended from Noah's children. And the two mountains that are to the right of the map, in the little cutout on the upper part and at the bottom running along the lower edge, those are Mount Ararat. And what I find fascinating about it on this map is there's nothing beyond it. And yet, Armenians have been a dominant force on the other side of the mountain in Persia for 100 years. So this is seriously, this is Armenians in the Ottoman lands. And when the nobleman takes it back to Bologna. We're not clear why he ordered it, but we had in the exhibition an Armenian map made in Bologna from the late 1200s. So there was a large and consistent Armenian community in the city, which was known as a great center of intellectual learning, and maybe there was some connection to there. It becomes part of the fabric of the life of Bologna. And the summer before it came to the Met, it was restored. It was just re-glued. It was actually in very good condition behind a great glass wall at the University of Bologna. And large numbers of general citizens of Bologna came to see this work being restored that was coming to New York. So it has gained recognition within the Armenian community. It's gained recognition within Bologna's Italian community. And I think academic communities are going to be able to take this and learn a whole lot about 17th century Armenians and the Ottomans in general. Gabriela Ulhojan, one of the great scholars of Armenian culture, whose brother was the head of the Mekhiris Fathers in Venice, who lent to the exhibition, in 2000 published the map in all of its details and translating all the Armenian into Italian. So take a minute more for it to get fully translated into something we all read quickly. But it tells us how widespread the Armenian communities were, and by the relative size of the churches, you know something of their wealth and power. And I'm going to now go back to the very beginning of the show. We have seen the three great things that came from your community that help people understand the breadth of the Armenian community. And then one of the things the people that reported on the show said they liked the most were the maps. And so you've seen the last map, a printed map from the West, and you've seen the middle map, which is an Armenian scholar and a man so Aramea Shelach was so important in his own time in Constantinople that Rachel Gasharian, one of the authors for the catalog, gave a good deal of a page to writing about him and his support of the creation of things like coffee houses. But we had one other map, and it is the earliest map that we had in the show. It's in the first gallery. It's in the case to the far left. It's my favorite map. And you see it here on the left. This is a map that is drawn around 1250. And it is drawn at the monastery of St. Albans, which is one of the most important monasteries in England, patronized by the king. And one of its most famous monks is Matthew Paris. And Matthew Paris draws these great maps of the world and maps of the Holy Land. And what you're seeing is the map of the Holy Land. And he knows where to put Armenia because Armenian monks visit St. Albans in 1228 and in 1252, and their visits are recorded. And they are described as very God and holy figures. And he asks them where Noah's Ark is, where they are, and they report that Armenia is 15 days' journey north of Jerusalem, and that on Mount Ararat, Noah's Ark sits. You can see it at the very top of the map, and then there are little wiggly lines around it. It is hidden by snakes and dragons, which is what you are seeing. And it protects the Armenians and its people. And then Matthew Paris puts Mount Ararat, just as Aramea Shalakida will do in 1691. He puts it at the western edge of the known world, because the top of that map is the end of the West. And in the text that he writes about it, he says that the Armenians control all the lands to India, and you don't. No way you've got armies occupying all the lands to India. But I think what you very much do have is you are the key spot for trade goods coming from China and Asia in general, Afghanistan and its paint, blue paint, into the Western Europe. So they imagine you controlling it all because it all flows through you and on to St. Albans. And we had this map in the gallery with the gold jewelry that has never been shown in an exhibition before, that the History Museum generously lent us, that has been found in the early mid-20th century in essentially really surface digs at the city of Devin, which was an incredibly important city in Armenia at the founding of the Christian era, and does very, very well as the second biggest city east of Constantinople through the time of the map of Matthew Harris, and then under Tamerlane it's just destroyed. So no city ever grew back on top of it, so it's a good archaeological site. So scholars are more happy about it perhaps than the people that were destroyed. And the jewelry that is found there is gold, and it's very elaborate, and it shows elements of the techniques of making jewelry that you find in Persia and in Byzantium. And so you can argue that they were imported or that they are made locally, but Anna Balian, an expert on goldwork who did the catalog entry, would suggest that the pair of earrings looked very pretty when they were dangling and tinkling, that the little loops and the semicircles are Byzantine imports. And that then in Devin, the 4 dangles on each ones were added. And what look like little seated monkeys on the ends of each one are actually very handsome royal figures seated in the Eastern pose of authority, so cross-legged, and bringing this part of Armenia that will always haunt how we try to describe Armenia, that if I tell you its connections are Eastern, then I can bring you the Western elements. If I tell you it's Western, then you can bring to me St. Abel Musa, who are Eastern elements. People coming to the show were very excited that they felt like they could know Armenia, but they didn't quite, and they were interested that it seemed to be something they could identify, but they didn't quite know how, and a large number of architectural historians spent time in the exhibition thinking about how to connect it with medieval Romanesque Gothic art, which I was very happy about. And we gave them an entire gallery of wonderfully large pieces of sculpture from little church models. You can see one on the far wall, and a few select hotchkars, the cross stones that develop in the Armenian Middle Ages that become signatures of your culture, that's what you will give to the United Nations when you identify yourself in this century. And what people consistently talked about was the beauty, the intricacy, the delicacy of the works, and how surprised they were by them. So I thought that we would look at 2 hotchkars. The one on the left came from the History Museum of Armenia to the exhibition, and is probably about the height I am on this platform. And it moves toward the type of intricate carving that we call lace carvings that Christina Moranchi wrote about for the catalog. And we also always write that that's a later type of hotchkar with that upper part that tilts forward, the little row of arcades across the top. What I can't show you is that that's not the entire hotchkar, that the bottom of it, which we did not know about until we were moving it out of Armenia. So we got a very weird packing crate, a rectangle with a little addition at the end of the rectangle, because it has a stone, undecorated flange to be stuck into another stone to anchor it. And I think that the hotchkar on the right is not a complete hotchkar, which 6 months ago I would tell you it was. I think what you're looking at is the middle section, the large cross on the left. That's the part that survived after the one on the right was knocked over, and the flange that was stuck into another stone broke off the bottom of it, and that when it landed, it popped the top part off. And if you look at both of them, and On the right, it's pairs of birds at the top. You can see that there's a little bit of the decoration missing, which would have gone on up into that additional part. So I think we're going to have to redate Hotchkiss a little bit out of this exhibition. And out of the fact, I wrote everybody I knew and said, do you know about these stone flanges? They are a new thing in our life. The stone on the right is very meaningful to the Met because the Armenian government approved its long-term loan to the Met. It is one of your national treasures because all Hotchkiss are national treasures in Armenia. And we renew the loan every 3 years, a painful experience in English and Armenian, but it means that we will not forget that we borrowed it, and Armenia will not forget that it lent it. And it has become a very, very popular work in our museum, and one that meant a great deal to Philippe de Montebello, a former director of ours, who, a Frenchman, became so moved by it that he told me it could be from France. There was no greater compliment that Philippe ever gave anything than that it could be from France. I'm looking at it for the moment because at the very bottom, you see some weird shapes in the middle. And what you are looking at are the symbols of the four evangelists. So you're looking at a gospel book symbolized by the head at the top of Matthew, and then a lion's head that looks very much like a Protean line for Mark. And across the bottom, the ox of Luke has been laid on its side, so it looks like a scorpion. And then going up the right side is a profile view of the St. John's eagle. And you can read this as the Word of God, from which you learn about the sacrifice of Christ that promises life everlasting. And the pairs of birds at the very top may even suggest that this could be a type of image that you could copy from a manuscript. And it seems to me so very fitting for a church which venerates the Word, not icons, and makes the Word the most important type of gift you can give, that this Hotchkiss, which is a gift to the Met, talks about that in its very design. I'm showing it to you because the thing everybody liked the most in the show were the manuscripts. And they were referred to over and over in the interviews we had. And we started in the first gallery with Mesrot Mashtats and the alphabet and a very early page of Armenian text, which looks weird because it was cut down to be used as a flyleaf in a later manuscript, and canon tables, the index for the Gospels that lets you know how many different Gospels talk about the Nativity of Christ or the Annunciation to the Virgin. When we talk about the Armenian alphabet, we often end up talking as if it made Armenians the other. It gives you a national language and you make incredible use of it over the centuries. But the first thing you do is copy things that make you part of the world. And we'll see three of them. So one of them is the Gospels. You bring the Word into Armenian. You bring the canon tables that are developed by Eusebius of Caesarea. You do Timpietos that probably represent the tomb of Christ. The Armenian one is at the top. The one at the bottom is Ethiopian. I can also give you one from Germany. I can give you one from Syria. There are a variety of these, but I gave you the Ethiopian one because I think we need to study so much more the connections between Armenia and Ethiopia. What you start off with having in common is you, as Armenians in your homeland, control the northern trade route, and Ethiopia controls the straits at the end of the Red Sea that gets to the black gold of pepper. And I think you are the two most important pinch pots on the two most major trade routes. And that in some way that brings you all together. You also convert to Christianity 50 to 75 years before the Roman state makes Christianity its official religion. And I always thought that more or less you translated with Mesrot Mashtat's alphabet, Armenian religious text, and that was the first generation. But then I learned as we were doing this show that the manuscript at the far right is by David Ungat, who is a great scholar. He studied at Alexandria in Egypt when it was the combination of Harvard, the Sorbonne, and Oxford. He was a major teacher of philosophy there, taught in Constantinople, put together a perfect textbook, which remains the Armenian textbook throughout the Middle Ages. It includes Aristotle. So this Armenian man, shown in the 13th century, a fairy tale version of him, brings in the 5th century Western classical learning into Armenia, having himself taught it. And his works, the one we have in the show is a young royal's textbook from the Middle Ages. The style of the image, this nice man writing like an evangelist portrait, relates to the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, which I could bore you with forever because it's my dissertation topic. But it's when Armenians are forced by the Byzantine emperor around the year 1000 to move to the Mediterranean. And they set up a state where Syria and modern Turkey run into together at the edge of the Mediterranean, which by the mid-13th century is the strongest, most powerful Christian state in the East. And the wealth of it you can see because all the manuscripts I'm showing you have gold for their background. By 1200, the most powerful man in Cilicia has gained a king's crown from both the Latin West and from Byzantium, and the Armenians are positioning themselves in terms of their importance. So I very much love the small manuscript on the left, which was handwritten by one of the great Armenian theologians, Narcissus of Lambron, and it is the Poems of Lamentation by Grigor of Narek, one of the great theologians of the Christian Church, recognized as such by Pope Francis in 2015. The manuscript we borrowed is the first time he's called a saint. Narcissus of Lambron, an archbishop, just says he's a saint and he remains a saint after that. It seems to have been no process. The poetry is extremely beautiful, and in the catalog I quote the end of his poems where he says that he wishes them to be read by all the people in the world. That's done in the late 1200s, in the mid-13th century, at the Catholicos of Ramkla on the Euphrates River. The Catholicos Constantine is a great patron of the arts, and one of the artists that he patronizes the most that remains famous to us today is Taras Roslin, who does manuscripts for the Catholicos and his family and for the royal house of Cilicia. And the picture that was in the show at the top is the ruins of the fortifications of the capital of Cilicia at Sis. And the center image is the young Prince Levon and his bride, Queen Kiran, for whom the Catholicos Constantine has ordered this gospel book from Taras Roslin. So I love to believe that the young prince is holding up the gift, the manuscript he is holding. The wardrobe he is wearing is Byzantine royal, and like the manuscript with Grigor Narek, it shows the Armenians positioning themselves as being equal to the Byzantine court. The silks are incredibly elaborate ones, and there are now a larger number of people trying to locate whether they are Armenian designs, Seljuk designs, early Mongol designs, because by this time, what the Armenians in Cilicia do is they're the westernmost edge of the Mongol trade routes. So Marco Polo goes to Ayas, which is a Cilician port, to get to China because the Armenians can help him get there. And will move him along from Cilician territories into the territories of Greater Armenia. And the type of elaborate designs that Taras Roslin does that you see in this very ornate canon table at the far edge are ones that are still dominant throughout the entire time of our exhibition. And I really should have Sylvie come up now, because this is Sylvie's great expertise, but we were able to draw from her knowledge and sophistication in the works that we borrowed for the show. And we've returned to Lake Savon, to Greater Armenia, to Gegard, and the Reliquary of Ashat II, and to these monasteries that are producing huge numbers of books at the same time that when Sylvie talks about the colophon saying miserable me, they keep saying miserable me and the world is falling apart, but they're turning out really handsome manuscripts, often with gold ground, so the world is probably not as bad as the way it is proper to describe yourself. I am nobody, you are somebody is a kind of a formula, as Sylvie pointed out. So on the left, at the upper left, the scribe Petros has just finished copying the gospel, his own gospel book. And he is handing, you can see him handing his ink pot to his disciple. So he is passing on the generation of the scribal workshop. And the two weird figures underneath, looking like they're drinking steins of beer, are actually paper polishers. And Armenia is one of the Christian communities to first use paper for manuscripts, and if you all look at paper, if it's really thick, it's lovely, and it doesn't hold nice little rows of writing very well, so the more it's polished, the more it holds ink neatly. And so these two men have heavy stones that they are polishing the paper with, and in the notes that Petros writes, he suggests that they are like angels to him, so that may be that he himself made them angels in this work of his. We know that scriptoria have people move between them. We know that manuscripts over time move between scriptoria. In the show, we showed manuscripts of 1300 that are being copied in the 1600s in Persia. And they have come from usually the Lake Van region. But we also think that there were model books where you had images you particularly liked, and that the center little booklet is an example of that. And this comes from the monastery of the Methodist Fathers at San Lazzaro in Venice. And the upper image is a very complicated figure composed of lots of other figures. Sylvie would trace its roots back all over the place, including India. What we were able to do through the generous loans of the Fathers in Venice and the Brotherhood of St. James in Jerusalem and the Rylands Library in Manchester, England, was to show you the original drawing, and then I only brought the most immediate copy, which came from the Brotherhood of St. James. And in the manuscript that it's copied into, that is Bucephalus, the mystic horse of Alexander the Great, because that manuscript and the one above it are the third work that we know were translated into Armenian about the time that Mithromastats develops the alphabet. And this is this wonderful fantasy of the life of Alexander the Great. So it's everything is miraculous. Alexander the Great was taught by Aristotle, whose works Armenians studied, and the tall man at the lower right is Aristotle teaching his pupil Alexander, as Alexander's horse is to the side. And then the favorite work for all the reviewers of the show was the manuscript at the top, another Alexander romance, in which Alexander describes how he is swallowed by a giant crab. See the giant crab. If you look at it closely, one of the figures has a crown on, so it's Alexander. And then when they get freed of the crab, they come to land, and they have to go into a land of darkness. And he realizes that if they leave the baby donkeys on the shoreline and take the mothers inland, that then when they want to get out of the land of darkness and back to their major camp, the babies crying will lead the mothers back. And that's in the text underneath it, describing it. The one on top, which is so very Armenian, by Zachariah Alganal, is not written in Armenia. It's written in Rome, Italy. It is written while he is on, in the 1500s, a trip sent from Echmiadzin to Rome. And the image we have is very much Zachariah's image. But he has a young artist working with him, Jacob of Yolfa. And he is another artist that we were able to pay attention to in the show. So you would think of artists as individuals, not just this is Dutch painting, but this is Dutch painting by this individual. So the two figures are on the left are by Jacob. And he paints himself, and the upper one, dressed in what I think is actually the Armenian merchant dress that is described in Europe as being something that merchants trying to make headway into getting trade in the East adopt, because it is so respected that it gives them an edge. And he is painting the second coming. So you have the vision of Ezekiel in the big circle, and above it the horns of Gabriel. And then in the work underneath it, which is one of the most amazingly weird things we had in the entire show, you have the head of God. And the figure on the left is the seventh day of creation. And along where his fingers are pointing are the animals of Ezekiel, which are also the symbols of the evangelist. And then on the facing page are the gates of paradise and God's head. Each of the days of creation, God's head grows larger, and then at the end it goes back small again, and you are welcomed into paradise, past gates which look a lot like Hotchkiss. And whether those designs are totally meant that way or not, they can be read that way. And in this same 16th century period, you have a number of amazingly innovative new images coming into Armenian art. They are often based on older traditions, but they don't exist in older works. So on the top right, you have King Tridot the boar that we have seen before. He's now kneeling with the purple robe over him, and you can see his great big pig face. And Gregory the Illuminator stands in blue azure, looking incredibly handsome. And all the Armenians look really awful. And I think it is a promise that as you become Christian, not only will Tridot become a human, but you will all become beautiful too, because otherwise you are really nasty people. And in the lower right, you have the Battle of Avila. So the battle in which Mamikonian loses to the Persians, and they're big elephants, but in losing, gains the right of Armenians to remain Christian. And the idea is, when you look at it in the catalog, you'll see that all the Armenians are outlined in gold. And it's thought that that is probably a signal that they will become saints. That with their death, they have sacrificed, and they will become saints. And as I come to the close, I used as the image for this gallery the monastery at Tatev, because it emphasizes something I wanted to contradict. It looks so isolated in the world, as if nobody would have ever been in contact with larger worlds. And I'm wearing a scarf from Tatev's celebration of its 1,000 years of being a great university. Its own great theologian is in the upper right corner, Gregory of Tatev, who was not only a scholar, a theologian, a supporter of fields like medicine and science, but an artist. And we borrowed in the exhibition one of the manuscripts he illuminated, so the Annunciation to the Virgin at the bottom is his own work. And the portrait of him is from a manuscript in an area that I never actually thought of Armenians being important, and now I'm fascinated by this area. It's Kaffa in the Crimea, and when the Armenians of Cilicia are being pretty clearly wiped off the face of the earth by the Mamluks rising to power in Egypt, many of them go to Crimea, and I never could figure out why you went from the Mediterranean to the north side of the Black Sea until I realized Armenians in the Crimea have gone to the last outpost of the Mongol trade routes, and they have, and which tie in with Bologna and Genoa. And so I've come to the end of my talk, and I didn't have any fantastic conclusion for you, but I wanted to make a point that matters a great deal to me and to people like Sylvie, and I hope to you and to your generation of students. Armenian studies are something that if we understand Armenia in the larger world context better, we will increasingly understand how Armenia helped weave the world together in the Middle Ages and past the Middle Ages, and that you are relevant in many ways that are not yet fully understood, besides bringing Aristotle almost to the Persian border. In the 14th century, in the Kingdom of Cilicia, a hand reliquary, the oldest Western European style reliquary, where you have the arm of the saint in his hand, arrives. We don't fully know why. It's dedicated to St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas is not a popular Armenian saint. He is a popular Byzantine saint. He was also the name of several Franciscan popes, and the Armenians are very involved with the Franciscan order of the Catholic Church in the 13th, 14th century. So maybe that's the link. We're still looking at that. But that idea of arm reliquary becomes very important in Armenia. And as you all know from the stirring of the Holy Chrism every several years, you stir it with the arm reliquary of St. Gregory the Illuminator. We had in the show, and I showed it to you very briefly in the very beginning, the arm reliquary on the far right. And it's the arm of St. Shahak-Patev, the last Catholic host who was the male heir of Gregory the Illuminator, and the one who did very much to encourage Metrobashtats to develop the Armenian alphabet, to make the word, both in the theological sense and in the broader sense of the wider world, accessible to Armenians. 10 years ago, when there was the wonderful show on Armenia at the Louvre, it was called the Arm Reliquary of St. Thaddeus. And in the time between then, in old photographic archives in Etchmiadzin, they have found the photograph in the middle. And while I flipped the figure on the right, so you have to work to make a match, that is the arm reliquary that was St. Thaddeus's arm at the Louvre, and we now know it's Shahak-Patev, because going up the right-hand side in Armenian and Russian and French is the description of it as the arm reliquary of Shahak-Patev. There is always so much to learn. There is so much to learn about Armenia. And so many people were moved by the show and what they learned. I would encourage a lot more scholarship, a lot more support of a lot more Armenian exhibitions, a lot more support of Armenian objects going into museums so that people can know about your art and culture. I think that as a non-Armenian, it is a great honor to be able to study what for most of you in this room is your own historical background. And I thank you for having me here today to tell you what we hope we've done for it with Armenia, with an exclamation point at the end. Thank you.